Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to wait one more minute for a couple committee members to log in successfully, and then we'll begin. Good afternoon, committee members. Just for your reference, we do have quorum, just we're having some issues getting the YouTube feed up and going, so it will be a couple moments before we can begin.
Good afternoon, Chair.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor. Perfect. So we do have all a committee. We're just waiting for the technical issues of YouTube to be resolved. Okay, apologies to committee and staff who's still with us. We are still working on getting the YouTube feed up before we can commence with the public meeting. So carry on. Good afternoon, committee members. We do have quorum, and we will now begin. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats of communication supports for council, standing and advisory committee meetings and information upon request. To make requests for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. To make a request specific to this meeting, please contact cwc@london.ca. Please know that during the stay-at-home orders, the City of London offices have limited access. Also, we are currently trying to get our YouTube feed up, but our eScribe is currently streaming to the city's website, so it is still a public meeting. I will now turn to the committee and look for disclosures of pecuniary interest. Okay, moving on to the consent items. There are 8 items on our consent list before us today. Looking to committee to see if they would like any of those items pulled. Okay, seeing none, all items will be before us. Looking to committee for questions for staff. We'll begin with Councillor Turner, and I'll start a speakers list. Councillor Turner? Councillor Turner, please proceed if you can hear me, and you are muted. Okay, looking for a mover and a seconder.
Sorry, Barb said that they can't hear anything.
Okay, looking to committee, can you hear us now? If someone could give a thumbs up, it'd be appreciated. Perfect. I'm going to assume that everyone's heard nothing that's been lovely and said so far. So I will begin again. We do have quorum, and the City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats of communication supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings, and information upon request. To make requests for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. To make requests specific to this meeting, please contact cwc@london.ca. And for the public, please note that the City of London offices have limited capacity during the stay-at-home orders. eScribe is currently streaming to the city's website, and we are working on getting the YouTube channel feed up and going still. Looking to committee for disclosures of pecuniary interest. Seeing none, I will look on to the consent items. We do have 8 items before us today, and looking to committee to see if they would like anything pulled and called separately. Mr. Mayor.
Yes, thank you, Chair. If I could have 2.2 pulled, please.
Certainly. Anything further from committee? Councillor Van Merbergen? Councillor, you're muted. Councillor, you're still muted.
Thank you, Chair. If we could pull 2.6, please.
Yep, certainly. So currently have 2.2 and 2.6 pulled. Looking to committee to see if there's anything further. Okay, seeing nothing further, I would look for a mover and a seconder, and then we have staff available for questions. Moved by the mayor, seconded by Councillor Cassidy. Opening up the floor for questions of item 2.1, 2.3, 2.4, 2.5, 2.7, and 2.8. I'll begin with Councillor Cassidy, and I will start a speakers list.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Please. Sorry, sorry, I got a message on my Zoom, but so I have a question on 2.3, 2.5, and 2.7. So for 2.3, the Philip Aziz and Sarnia Road and Western Road intersection environmental assessment. I know it's an environmental assessment, but I'm looking ahead to the future works at that intersection. and it talks about improvements in drainage and general overall improvements at that intersection. So I'm wondering if any of the work creeps on right onto the Philip Aziz Avenue. Is that a city-owned road, a city-assumed road, or is that entirely on Western University property? And if it is on Western property and we do end up doing some works on that particular stretch, would there be some cost sharing involved? It talks about having conversations with Western and with Brescia. So I'm just looking ahead what would happen if we're doing work right on Philip Aziz.
Perfect. Thank you for that question. And Mr. McCray.
Thank you, through the chair. Yes, this is the environmental assessment that'll scope out the improvements and the improvements in the city right-of-ways that will work with the surrounding land uses. Philip Aziz is, in fact, a city-owned right-of-way down to the river, so both the road and the underground infrastructure. So there's not a lot of works currently anticipated onto private property at the current time. The EA will identify any of those, and if that's the case, or even infrastructure blending into the city right-of-way that benefits a landowner, cost sharing discussions would be initiated.
Okay.
Councillor, please proceed.
Yeah, thank you for that. Moving ahead to 2.5, the supply and delivery of hydraulic drum brush chippers. So I have a question on that report. There were a number of RFPs in this agenda, and all of the other RFPs either say specifically that the winning bid was the lowest bid, or they include dollar amounts and more detailed information on all the bids that were received. But this one doesn't include any of that. It just simply says that it went over budget. So that's my first question on that one. Why were we not given more information on this RFP compared to the other ones?
Thank you, Mr. Stanford, for your response.
Thank you, and through the chair, the current agenda actually has a mixture of tender awards and RFP awards. And there is a difference on how we handle RFPs versus tenders. Now, for the chippers, it's an RFP that is done based on evaluation criteria, and staff list, according to the procurement policy, the best value for the city based on the evaluation criteria. So in this case, the firm that is listed for the chippers is the one that basically was the top ranking after the evaluation. On this agenda, though, there are a couple tenders, and tenders are handled differently. They're based on terms, conditions, specifications, and the bidders that submit on that, their names are listed with their submission price. And this is all done as per the requirements of the procurement policy, and we stay as consistent as possible for that. And just to repeat, just the difference between RFPs and tenders.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. I have a quick follow-up. So in it talks about the value of the winning bid, and it talks specifically about a couple of the added value measures, like added safety measures, things like that. So I'm wondering if that was a really defining reason of why this one was chosen as best value, and if other bidders were given the option to include those measures as well.
Mr. Stanford?
Through the chair, as part of the RFP process, all the requirements of what we were looking for were listed in the RFP. So the bidders basically had the equal opportunity to put forward their information, and that went forward then, and the 6 criteria that were evaluated are on page 40, and the winning bidder, once again, is the best value for the city.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that information. That's really helpful. So I have a question on 2.7, just a quick one, talking about supply and delivery of intersection detection systems. So just quickly, will these systems, I'm assuming it's going to be better able to detect other types of vehicles at intersections like cyclists, so that the lights will respond accordingly. So will that eliminate the need for, say, pedestrians to press a button to activate the crosswalk system?
Mr. McCray?
Yeah, thank you, through the chair. The evolution of the detection technology is something that we monitor closely. This technology that is getting approved today is radar, which is the best currently available. It is quite good at detecting cyclists and pedestrians. Still not quite perfect, so we're not at the point yet that we could eliminate pedestrian push buttons, but we're certainly monitoring the industry's progress and looking towards the future when that is possible.
So just a quick follow-up on that, Madam Chair, through you. I get questions about this all the time. So why do we have those buttons? Why wouldn't the walk signal be automatically activated when the light is green? Why would we make a pedestrian who arrived late at the intersection, why would we make them wait through a whole other cycle to cross the street when the light is green for cars?
Mr. McRae?
The intersections across the city are, there's a few different approaches on how they're managed. For example, in the downtown and the high pedestrian areas, they are managed that way with an automatic pedestrian cycle. So it's a balancing of needs. The pedestrian push buttons are a very specific requirement of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, in that they trigger the audible signal for the visually impaired pedestrians, and so they have somewhat of a combined benefit. And the AODA requires that different audible technologies to help guide those pedestrians through, and that's part of the pedestrian push button function.
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Looking to committee to see if there's any further questions on all items except 2.2 and 2.6. I did have one on regards to item 2.8, the Innovation Park Assumption Works tender award. Looking to staff to see if the infrastructure, we talked about pedestrians and vehicles, if there's any cycling infrastructure that's accommodated for within this plan.
Good afternoon, Chair. I can speak to that. At this point, there is not. It was when the assumption process started. It was prior to the London plan being finalized, but I'm more than happy to work with our colleagues in transportation to include cycling lanes in, or cycling network in the industrial park.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Sometimes we do hear from residents that if there's no bus route, they're really limited in how to get to some of these jobs as we expand. So thank you for those comments, Mr. McIntosh. Looking for a last look at committee to see if there's any questions or comments to staff. Okay, we already have a mover and a seconder, and I'm calling the question, and please vote in e-scribe.
Madam Chair, I'll vote yes.
Closing. Okay, we'll to this is the contract award for the Dingman Creek Pumping Station construction tender and questions. Mr. Mathers is with us here to answer committee's questions. Perfect. We'll start with Mr. Mayor and then Councillor Cassidy.
Thanks very much, Chair. I was appreciating the significance of the contract award and the importance of this particular project. I just like to hear from staff a little bit more background as to its impacts. I think we recognize this is critically important for London, but I think it'd be useful for the public. But certainly, I'd like to hear some additional background on this and its impact and the importance for the community with putting this in place, please.
Thank you for that, and recognizing it hugely affects the south end. I was excited to see this project come forward before us today. Mr. Mathers, could you please elaborate on the impacts for the south end and any operations in that area?
Through the chair, absolutely. This is a major project for our group, and it's really essential infrastructure to be able to provide growth, servicing to both London's industrial areas, but also residential growth in the southwest and the southeast, actually. And the other really added benefit of this alternative that we came up with, and kudos to the wastewater treatment operations folks for this, is that it provides redundancy. So now we have 2 pumping stations with 2 major force mains that service this area. So if there is an issue, for example, several years ago, there was a force main break on one of the major force mains in the area. So this would allow redundancy in those instances to be able to ensure that we don't have to overflow or bypass water into the natural waterways. So this is both a benefit from a growth perspective to be able to allow for that new infrastructure, but it also is going to help us in redundancy and ensure that we're not having bypasses in the future in this area.
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, thank you. The other question I've got, if I might, relates to the heritage preservation. And I saw that there is an historical farm on this particular piece of property. And that looks like we are going to be building an inn-like type of structure to accommodate this award. And my question is, unless I've misread it, is there a planned use for that particular farmhouse? What's the longer-term plan, please?
Mr. Mathers?
Through the chair, at this point, we've stabilized the building to be able to ensure that it be maintained appropriately. At this point, we don't have an alternative use, but we are working with other city partners to be able to determine a way that we can be able to use the facility in the future. In the actual construction of the pumping station, we are trying to keep that same character and make it look like it's its own agricultural style of building, and so that it will actually complement that heritage home as well. But yeah, in the long term, we are working with other groups in the city to be able to find a use, but we haven't at this point selected one.
All right, that's helpful. I appreciate that very much. Thank you, Mr. Mathers.
Thank you. Councillor Cassidy, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And through you to Mr. Mathers. I want to know about the peak shaving facility. So in the report, it says there had been a plan to develop or to build a completely separate shaving facility, but now it can be incorporated in this one. And even though this project is over budget because of the delays and everything, I'm wondering, it talks about the reduction overall to our global budget because we won't need this separate facility. Wondering if we have an estimate on what that savings will be and how it relates to this budget.
Thank you. Mr. Mathers?
Absolutely. Sorry. Absolutely. Through the chair. That was one of the great things that our staff had came up with is through the design process to be able to combine those different functionalities within this one project. And on the overall, so this project includes both system improvement and growth related funding. So if we take a look at that and also consider what we're doing in the future here is canceling that Digman Peak shaving facility, that there will be a net surplus of $600,000. So it was, even though that we've had these impacts from COVID as well that are noted in the report, that there will be a net savings going with this option.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks for that information.
Okay, I have no other hands up for committee members or visiting councillors. I will recognize Councillor Helmer, and then we will still need a mover and a seconder for this item when it's time.
I'm happy to move the item. I do have a question about it through the chair. How much room is there for this project to experience unforeseen delays without impacting the operation of the Maple Leaf facility? I know that they're kind of tied together in terms of having the need for the capacity. Seems like it's in an okay place right now, but sometimes there are delays, and I want to just get a sense of how we're going to manage that potential risk.
Thank you. Mr. Mathers?
Through the chair, that was one of the primary reasons why we selected this time to go forward with the construction, because we wanted to ensure that we were out in front of that work. So we do have contingency plans if there are delays. We have approximately at least 4 months at a minimum that we can have this project delayed in order to still be able to provide that servicing to Maple Leaf. But we do have some contingency plans that we could roll out in the case that there are further delays beyond that 4 months.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Mayor?
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to second that motion.
Perfect. That's been noted. And looking to committee or visiting councilors for any other further questions on item 2.2. Seeing none, as it's been moved and seconded, I'll call the question.
Chair will vote yes.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you. Item for consent is 2.6, being the supply and install of 2022 to 2028 infill tree RFT irregular results. Mr. McCray is with us to answer committee members' questions, and I will start a speakers list. Councillor Van Merbergen.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to staff. I'm just looking for some clarification here. Why do we only have one supplier on this rather significant contract?
Thank you. Mr. McCray, if you could speak to the councillor's question and what you believe long-term supply and operating contracts could do to help with this.
Yes, thank you through the chair. And I also have John Parsons here to contribute as necessary. It was an open tender, so it was open to the entire industry. The urban forest strategy identified longer term contracts to secure longer term supply of trees for the forest city as being an important way to go forward. We do know that the industry is under pressure currently to supply caliber size trees. So those are 50 millimeter trees measured at 5 feet off the ground. So they're sizable trees, and due to a number of factors, including the umbrella ash borer and other tree pressures, that there's not an abundance of supply. So we suspect that is a contributing factor. But it was openly tendered on the city's procurement website and open to the entire industry.
Thank you, Councillor. Is there a follow-up?
Okay, I do have another question. So it sounds to me like this was basically an ongoing supply issue. So that obviously makes some sense. So my other question is, how many trees, okay, for the amount of money we're talking about, I think it's 3.2 million. Let's say, for example, 2022, which is just a year away. Do we have an idea of what 3.2 million buys in terms of the number of trees? Is there a range?
Mr. McCray?
Yeah. Through the chair, our annual planting, it is somewhat variable in that this contract also supplies the self-funded development, new subdivision planting on behalf of developers that they reimburse the city for. It also varies somewhat year to year with the replacement plantings on capital contracts. But in rough terms, the annual tree planting that this contract would provide is in the order of 4,000 to 5,000 to 6,000 trees per year.
Okay, that is helpful, because I wasn't able, I may have missed it, but I wasn't able to actually see what we're getting in terms of trees for that kind of money. So it sounds like it's between 4,000 and 6,000 in terms of a range. Would that be correct?
That's been the historical range in the last few years, yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I'll recognize Councillor Cassidy next.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you to Mr. McCray. I know that it's quite a bit higher. The successful bid is quite a bit higher than what was actually budgeted, but in the report it talks about the improved parts of this that the successful bidder camera will be using. So the improved techniques and inspections, soil augmentation, watering, et cetera, and so we're hoping that will improve the survivability of the trees, because it is a high stress situation in many of the locations, being in the boulevards and things like that, high traffic areas. So I'm wondering, what is the current survival rate of these infill trees, and what would be the anticipated survival rate with the improved processes of the successful bidder here?
Thank you. Mr. McCray on tree mortality.
Yes, we are very aware that the boulevard where the bulk of these trees are getting planted is a challenging environment for trees. We have tree mortality rates within a year to two, of between 4% and 8%. And so that is an important part of the aspect of this tender, is better planting and better tree aftercare. So the current process has soil augmentation, which is essentially digging a bigger tree pit and providing better soil for the tree to get established. Now that's done sort of as on an exception basis, but what we've learned is that it really is necessary given the common conditions in the boulevard. So the tender that's up for approval today provides that on a more cost-effective basis. So it is sort of an automatic. So it's a more efficient, cost-effective process that will bring those mortality rates down and provide for a better life cycle investment and longer surviving trees.
So, Madam Chair, do we have any kind of estimate on how that might improve? Do we expect that mortality rate to come down to 3 to 6% instead of 4 to 8, or we're just at this point waiting and seeing?
That's something that we measure on an annual basis. So we'll certainly have a keen eye to seeing what the improvement are. We're very confident that it will improve the mortality rates, but it'll need to be something that we measure in the coming years.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and I'll move to Councillor Turner next. Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. More than just a comment, the questions are good. This seems to be quite consistent with a lot of the work that Trees and Forest Advisory Committee have been doing. It was identified a while back, as I remember, even prior to 2 terms ago, when TFAC was established, that tree survivability in the plantings was something that we really needed to work on. So I'm really encouraged to see this as just becoming a part of the contract, that it's all in, that our investment in the trees, that doesn't just end in the planting, it's in all that aftercare and everything around that. So my thanks to staff for bringing this in, and it's nice to see it laid out in a report to say how that looks in the contract itself. Thanks.
Thank you for those comments, Councillor. And I have one question to Mr. McCray or Mr. Parsons. How long does it take for that tree to grow to the caliper that the city is looking at purchasing?
I will pass that question over to Mr. Parsons if he has an idea.
I will try to. Could you repeat the question, please?
How long would it take, per your estimate, for a tree to grow to the caliper at which the city is looking at purchasing, recognizing it's 5 feet? At 5 feet, it measures a certain size.
Through the chair, to Chair, Madam Chair, it's the trees are started as a small whip, and it probably takes about 5 to 6 years to become a caliper tree.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I just thought it was helpful for the public, knowing that there's a tree shortage out there due to oak wilt, ash borer, and other issues, that these trees that we're looking at purchasing and planting had to start 5 to 6 years ago to be the caliper of which we need. So I see no further questions from committee, except for Councillor Helmer. Please proceed.
Thank you. Through the chair, I just have two questions. One is for the trees that are paid for through the developments and they're cost shared that way. Will the per tree cost go up over time so that we've properly recouped those costs? I'm a bit concerned that the increase in cost per tree will fall on the property taxpayer and not necessarily be fully recovered.
Perfect. Mr. McRae?
Yes, we've been in discussions with the development industry to transition smoothly into this contract, and have identified the full value of the tree planting going forward as per this contract, and gained an understanding of that in agreement with the industry.
Thank you very much. Glad to hear that. I wanted to ask too about the possibility, I think it's closed right now, but the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund from the federal government. I know tree planting is actually eligible area of expenditure for that fund. And I know the federal government's aiming to have something like 2 billion trees planted throughout the country. Here we are with an aggressive program, and we certainly could use some help. I wonder if there's a possibility for seeking some funding between now and say 2028 from that fund when it opens up again for applications.
Mr. McRae?
Yeah, thank you through the chair. It's a good flag that the councillor provides. Tree planting is something that we've kept in mind for the various funding opportunities that arise, and as the different programs roll out, we'll continue to keep it in mind for City of London benefit.
Thank you.
Perfect. Seeing no hands from committee or visiting councillors, this item does require a mover and a seconder. Moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by the mayor. Okay, I'll call the question.
Chair, I'll vote yes.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you. That concludes our consent items. We have no scheduled items. And our item for direction, we do have one, resulting from the third report of the Cycling Advisory Committee. They have asked for several things. They've asked for staff in regards to the Masonville plan. They've asked for staff to report back in regards to a pump track, and then we'll also need to have that report received. So we do have draft wording ready from what the committee asked, but looking for committee of what you would like to do with the request from the Cycling Advisory Committee, and then a mover and a seconder for that. We do have staff here as well to speak to what the conversation was like at the Cycling Advisory Committee, and to note to this committee, we have received communication from Cycling Advisory Committee in regards to a pump track, but there has been other communications over the last while in regards to what opportunities can invest within the city for BMX biking as well as mountain biking. And it's the request of the Cycling Advisory Committee of what potential funding is out there in regard, as well as where a facility could actually be located. And that's on page 59 of your report. Okay, Councillor Cassidy.
Through you, Madam Chair, I have a question to staff about the pump track item. I wonder if I could get staff's comments on what their thoughts are, and also a brief explanation of what is a pump track.
Perfect. Thank you to that. And I will go to staff for those answers, and then I'll recognize Councillor Turner. Jeff, are you with us? Jeff Brune?
Yes, through the chair. A pump track is a series of, it's a track route that goes through the park with a series of humps and curves on the side of the pathway that allow a cyclist to use their momentum to other than pedaling, to go up and down hills and up over curves on the pathway system. So it's usually a looped pathway that encourages cyclists, usually BMX, but can be a series of different types of cyclists, to more use their momentum to go up and down over these humps and curves on the pathway system. So it is a popular activity. It has been constructed in other cities across the province and across Canada, and it is a growing sport.
Is there a follow-up, Councillor Cassidy?
Yes, I wonder if this has been like on staff's radar, if there were plans, would this be, I know that there are like skateboard parks, so it sounds kind of similar to that. So had there been plans either with Parks and Recreation or other city divisions to investigate this kind of facility?
Okay. To staff?
Yes, through the chair. There are a number of different cycling sport activities within the industry, and staff have assessed those in the past. There have been requests in the past for a series of different types of bike activities, from BMX parks to pump tracks. The recreational pathway system you see in London is obviously the most popular, and that's what's been invested in the past. But it is a growing sport, series of sports, and there is growing interest within the community to see more of those activities accommodated. We have looked at them in the past, but they have not been a priority with respect to other activities identified in the Parks and Recreation Master Plan for funding.
And Madam Chair, one final question. Is it becoming a priority? Is it you know, it's obviously been looked into in the past by staff. I know we get a number of requests for recreational facilities. I know the big one that I've been getting over the last couple of years has been pickleball. Cricket is extremely popular and growing, and when we're seeing some additional cricket facilities in London, if staff were to invest any kind of significant time investigating this, would it take away from others, other things that they're looking into? I just want to get a gauge on whether it's a good use of staff time.
Thank you. To staff?
Yes, through the chair. I think it is a process that's worth investigating further. Through the most recent Parks and Recreation Master Plan update, it wasn't a high priority compared to other recreational amenities across the city, but staff are aware of growing need for that sport across the region, and there is enough interest in that for us to look at it comprehensively to determine what type of locations it could fit in, what type of public engagement would need to happen to make that proceed forward if it is in fact viable. And we can also take a look at what sort of timing windows and budget requirements would be needed. As of right now, there is no budget in our 4-year capital budget forecast to accommodate this request, but we can look at that in the short and long term to see if we were to add that as a priority, what, if anything, that might displace within the Parks and Recreation Master Plan, and what that funding envelope would need to be to make this a successful implementation.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Madam Chair. Then I'm happy to move the cycling advisory report along with the action items, but I'll let other people speak.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Also for committee to note, some correspondence has been received. There is a working group within the pump track community who would like to see this done, who have offered to volunteer and help and provide public engagement, as well as interest in helping to fundraise should the city find an opportunity to move forward. I have Councillor Turner next, and then I saw Councillor Helmer after Councillor Turner.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Mr. Bruin. That addresses a bit of the questions because we have received a number of correspondence regarding this. And so it shows up in the Cycling Advisory Committee report as well. I had, in some of the correspondence, they had reference to the Recreation Master Plan. And so there's a component in the Master Plan, Parks and Rec Master Plan, called skate and bike parks, and it states the city's been receiving requests for bicycle-based infrastructure in parks, e.g. dirt jump, pump tracks, technical bike parks, cross-country mountain biking facilities, dating back to the 2003 strategic master plan. So this has been going on for a little while, well, about 17, 18 years now. The city does not currently provide any dedicated BMX or mountain bike parks, although some non-municipal facilities permit these types of activities. To promote responsible riding outside of the protected natural areas, it is recommended that the city support these activities through the development of an initial outdoor BMX bike park guided by a feasibility study. Longer term supply should be informed by a strategy that identifies capital projects and practices that can support the sport, as well as requirements for minimizing the risk. So specifically in that, it references a feasibility study. So recognizing that right now in our four-year capital plan, we don't have any funds allocated specifically to develop this. It might be important to start the work on the feasibility study side of this, especially if it's been talked about for 18 years. Any thoughts through you, Madam Chair, perhaps Mr. Bruin, about what might be required to do a feasibility study in its own right, and how that can help inform the work going forward, especially for future budgets, perhaps?
Mr. Bruin.
Through the chair. Yes, the Parks and Rec Master Plan did identify a recommendation for this feasibility study. It is something that staff could consider looking at more thoroughly. For a feasibility study to occur, it's probably a larger process than assessing the opportunities for a pump track in a location in the city, but it may be beneficial for a more comprehensive look at all bike-related sport amenities across the country right now, the needs of that community, and how the City of London may or may not be able to accommodate all those uses, and how those relate back to our current bylaws that govern under the Parks and Rec bylaw on where cycling and how cycling can occur in different types of parks in the city. So we could look at a more broader assessment of feasibility study to look at all of those options. A consultant would be required to undertake that exercise, and it would probably go through a small RFP process to ensure we have a comprehensive look at the whole system.
Councillor Turner.
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. I have some worries that scope becomes rather large. The difference between all cycling amenities within the city, so that could sound like multi-use pathways and that versus specific site-specific allocation of space and a facility in its own right. So I don't think those are necessarily the same thing, I guess. Being able to make sure that we have pathways and facilities and a cycling friendly environment, I think is very much part of the transportation master plan and should be. And on the Parks and Recreation master plan side of things, that's taking a look at specific amenities that support the recreational side of things. Perhaps I'm interpreting that a little bit wrong. I do worry that if we were to look at the breadth, the entirety of it, as you described, Mr. Bruin, that might be a lot to bite off. I think it's important work, but perhaps it goes a little bit further than what's being asked here. I'd be interested in your thoughts, though.
Mr. Bruin.
Yes, through the chair, I do agree with you, Councillor Turner. A broader feasibility study to look at all forms of cycling, sport, and recreation is a much broader exercise. I think there's enough interest and recommendation and guidance in the current Parks and Recreation Master Plan to identify the need for certain types of cycling-friendly activities within the city. And I think the current request could be handled more on a site-specific assessment process where staff could look at where the current request could potentially be accommodated without displacing other forms of active recreation. And the staff could look at how that the specific request could be implemented within a time frame and within existing budgets and or future budget opportunities. So yeah, my recommendation tied to the current request is that we do keep the scope focused on the immediate request for a pump track, and then we can defer to the Parks and Recreation Master Plan for guidance on that.
Through you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Bruin. I think that sounds quite appropriate. And if the motion reflects that, or if the motion as it's crafted, as Councillor Cassidy addressed, and it just makes sense, that's all part of it, then great. If it requires some amendment, I guess I would look to the clerk to see if that requires further clarification or if you'd like further direction, but it sounds like that's incorporated in there.
Okay, the clerk is just going to send the current wording out to committee members for review, and then we can firm up any wording to allow staff to do what they need to do to get back with the answers as directed by CWC and the Cycling Advisory Committee. In the interim, Councillor Turner, do you have any other further questions?
No, thank you. That was all helpful. I think if we can, perhaps the report back is just to be able to identify opportunities for a feasibility study to this regard, rather than necessarily answering all the questions of the location and all of that. I think that helps to get us a little bit further and help identify funding or what that scope of that funding might have to end up being for that plan.
Perfect. Just for committee's information, in the pre-meeting I had with staff, we're looking at the ballpark around $400,000 for a pump track was a number that came out in our pre-meeting. Councillor Helmer, I saw you briefly on screen with your hand up, looking to your turn to ask any questions if you still have any.
Councillor Turner covered it.
Perfect. Okay, the wording has been emailed to committee members. And it's on eScribe as well if you want to refresh your screens and have a look at it. And then I do have a mover in Councillor Cassidy, and we would be looking for a seconder. Okay, so the wording is up in eScribed. Councillor Van Meerbergen, do you have a question or a seconder?
No, what I'd like to do, if we could call the pump track portion of the motion separately.
Yep. Yeah, so we're just separating that out. Councillor Turner?
Perhaps it might be the wording is directly from the committee report rather than with any amendments. And so B clause 2 says the Civic Administration be requested to investigate the placement of this type of facility in the City of London and report back at a future meeting with the findings, including funding opportunities. I think that's a step a little early, and perhaps the recommendation that we make in this is that the Civic Administration be requested to report back on the process for a feasibility study for a similar, or for this cycling amenity or something to that effect.
Okay, we had discussed feasibility, public engagement, timing, and budget were all mentioned throughout Mr. Bruin's comments. So looking to The mover, if you're fine with a more general-based staff report back on feasibility of cycling-related facilities. Okay, that's a thumbs up from Councillor Cassidy. And the clerk is typing furiously to get this updated for you. Councillor Turner?
Happy to second that, Madam Chair. I think that's helpful because that's the first step in this, is to the feasibility study process. We'll be able to identify the funds associated with the feasibility study and then be able to take a look at funding opportunities for the facility itself.
Perfect. Thank you. The wording has now been updated in eScribe. I'll let the mover and seconder have a look at it. And then if you're happy with it, I would have the clerk read it out for those joining us virtually. Councillor Turner?
Just not to be too nuanced on this, that motion says that they come back with the feasibility study. I think we need to be able to approve the start of a feasibility study. We need to know what that cost is and what's involved with that. So that staff report back on the process for initiating a feasibility study.
So process and fees associated with the feasibility study?
All of that fun
all
stuff.
All of it,
yeah.
All that good stuff. Okay. Okay, that wording's just being updated. Okay, the wording has been updated. Looking to the mover and seconder if you want to say the placement of pump track facility or just various cycling facilities. As I know, we've also discussed the BMX park and mountain bikes as well through Mr. Bruin. I just don't want us to paint ourselves in too specifically that we can't. I assume a feasibility study would look at diverse aspects. Mr. Bruin, would the wording in this be adequate for your department to look at what you need to look at?
Through the chair, I don't see the wording myself, but from the discussions I've heard and recommendations I've heard, it would give us enough direction to move forward. For staff, there's a big difference between assessing the process to establish a pump track versus a process to establish and assess the need for a number of different types of cycling infrastructure. That would be a much larger process. So that would be a consideration, is whether you want staff to assess all forms of bike sport activity versus the request at hand of just a pump track, but open to input on that.
Looking to Councillor Turner and Councillor Cassidy, if you want the wording before us that says the Civic Administration requests a report back on the process and fees associated with the feasibility study with respect to the placement of pump track facility, and then it being noted several communications were received. Councillor Cassidy?
We were responding to a request for action from the Cycling Advisory Committee, and they were quite specific with the pump track item, which is why the motion is the way it is. I'm hesitant to open it up and make it so broad.
Okay, so you're good with the wording. Okay, and Councillor Turner, are you fine with the wording that's before us in eScribe?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
But yeah, I recognize what Mr. Bruin is saying. If perhaps through you, Madam Chair, I can ask to you, what would be the preference of staff so that we can provide the latitude necessary to effect this mandate?
Mr. Bruin?
Through the chair, I believe staff preference would be to focus on a pump track initially. And what I would suggest is the process we come up with to assess the viability and how a pump track could be established. That process could probably also be transferred and used in the future for other forms of spike sport activity. So this could be a starting point and a trial run for future discussions if those prove necessary.
Perfect. Thumbs up from Councillor Turner. The wording, we seem happy with what's before us. So we will be calling A and B separate. So I will just ask the clerk to read out A, and then we'll vote on it as it's been moved and seconded, and then we'll move on to B, which contains the pump track information.
That the following actions be taken with respect to the third report of the Cycling Advisory Committee from its meeting held on April 21st, 2021. A, the following actions be taken with respect to the public meeting notice dated March 10, 2021 from SY's Senior Planner related to an official plan amendment for the Masonville Secondary Plan. Part 1, a subcommittee be established to review the above noted Masonville Draft Secondary Plan and report back at a future meeting of the Cycling Advisory Committee. Part 2, the Civic Administration be requested to attend above noted future CAC meeting to discuss the subcommittee report to be brought forward. And Part 3, the Civic Administration be requested to provide maps of the cycling routes in the area under the Masonville Draft Secondary Plan and how they connect with existing cycling infrastructure and integrates with the Cycling Master Plan. Part B, that the following actions be taken with respect to the City of London pump track.
Okay, perfect. So that's what's on the floor, and that vote on the Masonville information request is what's being called in eScribe right now.
So Chair, I'll vote yes on that.
Closing.
Perfect. I'll now ask the clerk to read out to the pump track information.
Part B reads, the following actions be taken with respect to the City of London pump track. Part 1, the Civic Administration be advised that the Cycling Advisory Committee supports the creation of a pump track facility. And Part 2, the Civic Administration be requested to report back on the process and fees associated with the feasibility studies with respect to the placement of a pump track facility. It being noted that the communication appended to the agenda from B. Castle and the delegation from S. Noman with respect to this matter was received.
Perfect. This item's been moved and seconded as well, and the question's being called.
Chair, I will vote yes.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-1.
Perfect. And Part C is just a motion to receive everything within the Cycling Advisory Committee report, and it's been moved and seconded as well, and that question's being called.
I'll vote yes, Chair.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
That concludes the items for direction. There's a deferred matters list, looking for a conversation on that or a mover and a seconder. Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Chair, with apologies, I have to declare an interest in item 5.4 to do with 747 Waterloo Street, as my wife and daughter have a cupcake business at that location.
Perfect.
So I'll be abstaining from the whole item.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And I was advised by staff that your conflict will hopefully be resolved mid-next month. so we could, I love cupcakes, but, okay, so that's a conflict for the mayor. So looking for a mover and a seconder from committee. Moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Helmer. Calling the question.
Chair, I will abstain.
Closing the vote. Closing the. Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0 with 1 abstain.
Thank you for that. That concludes our public portion of the agenda. We are going into camera for, there's 3 matters for litigation and client solicitor privilege. So looking for a mover and a seconder for a motion to go in camera. Councillor Turner, seconded by Councillor Van Merbergen. Calling the question.
I'll vote yes, Chair.
Closing the vote, the motion.
Our public feed will stop while we go in camera, and just for committee members, there'll be a couple of moments while we get the correct people into the meeting that we need to proceed.